Welcome, everybody. How is everybody doing today? All right. My name's Kevin Hill. I'm a senior product manager at Salesforce, and I work on UI frameworks here. Today, we're going to, well, I guess I did my intro. You can follow me on Twitter if you want. I've got my Twitter handle. Of course, the safe harbor statement, if you have not seen it before, here it is again. What I wanted to do is get into what we're talking about today. I chatted with a few of you in the audience, and some of you are new to Salesforce, some of you have been developing it for a while. How many people out there are writing JavaScript today using a framework? We have a few hands that have gone up. And I heard some Angular out there. Anybody writing in React or Vue? Cool, all right. Well, it might sound funny, but what we're going to talk about a little bit is web standards and where they're headed, because that kind of sets the stage for what we're really hoping you get out of this time. That JavaScript has actually matured tremendously, and it's really shaping up to be the next framework. And we're going to get into kind of some of the trends that you've seen over the last 10 years and walk you through that. We've created an SFDX project up on GitHub, and the URL will be in this deck, and I encourage you to go check it out. And there's a lot of code in there that helps you deploy to Salesforce, so you can test out different frameworks if you want. We picked a couple that were popular at the time to go and write an application in, and we'll talk about kind of the comparisons between some of those things. Really, if you think about web standards, they have a very similar goal to Salesforce in that code you're writing in the standard, it's always going to work. Whenever you come to Salesforce and write code, we want to make sure that it's always going to work. And that's one of the advantages that we really found if you're looking at just learning JavaScript. So let's get into what that looks like. So this is a brief history of web standards. It goes beyond this. So Chrome just celebrated its 10th birthday this year. I think it was a month or two ago. I'm sure people saw the tweets about that. But if you go back 10 years ago, IE7 was king. Who here has had to write code for IE7 or earlier? Yeah. It was a different world back then. This was really still a time when most of the experiences were being driven from server. Client wasn't really this thing that was prolific, and single-page applications were kind of forced into existence. I remember having to do a lot of unnatural code to do routing, right? I don't know if you remember doing some code where you'd look at the hash symbol and stop the navigation of a browser to do routing. This is before frameworks came up with routing. But this is the type of thing that was happening back then 10 years ago. 10 years ago is also around the time when HTML5 standards came into play. And this is also when Chrome started developing as a browser, and they did a very good job of rapid deployment of features, which if you fast forward 10 years into today, Chrome is now top used browser across mobile and desktop and all platforms. But really, it's kind of this pinnacle of the standard. If you look at the wording of the standard that was changed, you can clearly see applications were called out. Prior to this, applications weren't really called out in the standards. I think back then, people were still arguing whether we should actually go forward with HTML 4.01 or XML as a standard. And this was a big debate on the web. Thankfully, we didn't go down either of those paths, and we started to simplify things and saying, well, why don't we build the things that applications need versus worrying about, I don't know, a 400 or 600 page standard that nobody's going to read. So if you look, I've only plotted some of the features that have been developed over about the last 10 years. You can start and look back, drag, drop. It was sort of a table stakes, like a lot of desktop apps did this, so why wouldn't the web platform go and invest in this as well? There were some early starts to support offline, like app cache. While app cache didn't really come into play in the long run, we now have wonderful things like service workers, that programmatic way to control your caching technology. The thing that I've become most excited about, especially in preparing for this talk, was custom elements. Custom elements, you've kind of been using, browsers have actually been using custom elements for a long time. They just never made them available to us. The video tag, the select tag, when you put those, like all this magic happens. But now you can go make your own magic happen through custom elements. And this is one of the catalysts that really caused us to compare to frameworks. Because over time, as frameworks have developed, they put natural pressure on web browsers to go and add native functionality and features. And custom elements is one of those things that's really kind of brought it up to some of the things that the frameworks are doing today. And we'll get into some of the comparisons. JavaScript has been amazing. Back in ECMAScript 5, this is when strict mode was introduced. Personally, I'd love to work on ECMAScript because it seems like every other release you can take a vacation if you look at the list of features. However, ES6 is really something that introduced classes, and it has really kind of started JavaScript down a very robust path. It's really growing up as a language. And you're getting into even future stuff with like what's coming down the pipe in ES8. You know, on the web today, though, if you go look at examples, you're really going to find ES5 examples. Not a lot of people have kind of been going into, make all their examples ES6 and all that. And when we were talking about this, like, there's so much there that gets you down the path of, like, if you explore what's here, you might not want to go and jump in and use React or Vue. It's not to say that they don't have purposes, to create dev efficiencies and these other things, but you might be surprised at what's actually there in JavaScript today. That's kind of the point. So how many people here have never written JavaScript? There's a few hands. There's a great place to start, MDM Web Docs. If you've never been exposed to JavaScript before, this is kind of one of the de facto places to go on the web today, and Mozilla Network's done a great job of kind of starting if you don't have a lot of knowledge. If you know a little JavaScript but you want to jump into ES6, some of these great things I'm talking about, there's a ton of resources. This is just one that I quite like. It kind of, not a lot of cruft, it really gets into explaining things. Also, there's great online editors. CodePen's amazing. If you just read a little sample, you want to jump in and test out your code, jump in there and go play with it. Also, if you have questions, Stack Overflow is a great resource, but there's so many other resources as well. It's a search engine. You have your JavaScript question, you're probably going to go find the answer. And so I put this slide up here just so from the varying degrees of audience, you kind of know where to go to start with modern JavaScript. The reason I'm showing you this and we're talking about the standards is I'd love for you to avoid this. This was a tweet recently. I've actually worked with Anton, so I know him fairly well, but jQuery, Angular _React, and a bunch of plugins to show one data table. This is one of those framework effects that have happened naturally over these 10-year periods. I'm sure they started out with jQuery. And then somebody else came along and they said, well, we want to go enhance this. And so instead of maybe rethinking jQuery, it's like, let's go add in another library, another library, another library. So this is one of the patterns that becomes prolific with frameworks over time, is that you just keep adding new frameworks. And sometimes you don't really even have the developer around anymore that knew how to use the first one. What I'd love is to see a world more like this. Does anyone know GitHub just removed jQuery from their site? It was a 6-month process. It was actually, their blog's great. I encourage you to go read it. And what did they replace it with? No framework. They just used responsible polyfills for anything they needed to fill down level, and everything else was just JavaScript. I sent a tweet to him and I asked, like, hey, did you guys see any perf benefits to this? And he's like, well, it was hard to measure because they removed it over a 6-month period of time, but he's like, yes, pages are loading faster right now, but they didn't have a lot of data. So JavaScript frameworks and libraries. Out of the top 100,000 trafficked websites on the internet today, can anyone guess what the most used library or framework is? Shout it out. Who said? Did you say jQuery? Yeah, it's totally jQuery, like by a wide margin. And this goes back to the time when jQuery came around. It was solving some problems. It was putting great pressure on browser vendors to go and support things that we need, like query selectors. Now that it's there by default today, GitHub's like, why are we carrying around all this code and why are we loading up all this code? All these little dots at the bottom, these are frameworks, right? Frameworks on the top websites are used not as much as you might think. Like 3% is kind of like a good framework, as far as like impact on websites. And I mean, React's probably high because Facebook uses it on all their properties and these sorts of things too, right? But if you go back a year prior to this, it wasn't React, right? Maybe it was Angular. If you go back a year prior to that, maybe it wasn't Angular. Could have been Ember, could have been maybe Knockout, something like that. And so the point is, like, over time, frameworks, come and go. And like nothing's actually stuck as much as jQuery. It's a very interesting observation. What we're finding, though, is frameworks these days see kind of the point of what I'm trying to make with this talk. Like these custom elements are supported. Most of these frameworks actually didn't have to go do a lot of work to support custom elements, which is part of the web component family. And so if you look at this, the majority are actually quite highly rated. I think React is probably the lowest support. Polymer's almost there. And then you've got the versions of Angular. This is a great site by Rob Dobson that tracks all of the framework's progress, and over time they've actually been converging more and more to support custom elements. So let's compare a few examples in Visualforce. And I talked about the GitHub project. It's right up here on the screen. I encourage you to go there and get started. We have a pretty good README file to get you up and running. And basically, it's going to create a Visualforce application with 3 different tabs showing you these different frameworks. So we've got vanilla JavaScript, React, and Vue. Equivalent functionalities where it's a data table, double click to edit columns, and they're all kind of functionally equivalent, and you see different code. I'll just to kind of show you the project to get a little bit oriented, I was going to jump into VS Code. So if you're familiar with Visualforce, these are where my Visualforce pages sit. Actually, you don't really need to touch a lot of that code. All of the code we have auto-generates the Visualforce, and it minifies the code, and it makes it really beautiful and fast and loads like that. We have this packages directory. Inside the packages directory, you're going to see one folder per application, so vanilla JavaScript, React, and Vue. The nice thing when we were developing this is it's also easy to develop this offline. So here's my React application working just like I was showing you in the demo, but I can say hello Visualforce, save, and it's live coding. So there's a rapid iteration as well. It's fun to play with frameworks when you're doing this. I actually encourage anyone to go send PRs or clone this and maybe put in your favorite framework and try and replicate the same data table that we created. Okay. So that was just to get you oriented to the project so you can go play with it. But what I want to do now is kind of walk you through some of the code. So instead of showing you this slide, I actually showed you the project. But one of the points here is we use the standard best practice. So we use create React application, which if you're going to go start a new React application today, you're going to go use this tool, and it makes all the project files run well, does the local development. For JavaScript, we just use JavaScript, really easy and straightforward. For Vue, we use the Vue CLI. So we were trying to start with what's the most recent thing that you would use as a web developer coming into these things today. So if we take a second and we look at the Vue component, what does that look like? So everyone's used to declarative. Vue produces this declarative data table, and it kind of looks like HTML, although you do see the v-bind and the v-on attributes. These aren't really kind of standard HTML. It's a Vue-specific thing. And that's something that you're going to have to go learn if you're going to go write Vue code. Other than that, though, it was really kind of standard HTML. If you look at the JavaScript below, you've got imports, you've got exports, you have to declare your components for Vue, you've got properties, data, and then lifecycle events. And so this is sort of the code in my project condensed just to give you a sense of this is the pattern you're going to follow when you go write a Vue component. Now, the entire Vue application that we deployed, gzipped, is 35.4 KB. I mean, it seems small, but it's still 35.4 KB. React is a little different. It doesn't quite follow the same pattern as Vue or as just JavaScript. In fact, it really, really likes to have HTML code inside of JavaScript. I know some people love this. Personally, it reminds me of ASP.NET or JSP pages where you're mixing. I love the React. They're modern. It's cool. They're kind of going back to stuff I used to do. I love it. But it's a different pattern to follow. And this is really something you have to go learn with React. And again, this is condensed code, but you have import statements, export statements. You have a render method that kind of outputs your data table. The React application is 38.6 KB gzipped over the wire. Now we're on to JavaScript and custom elements. When I look at the HTML markup here, the beautiful thing is it's HTML. There's no like custom things going on in there. There's no weird syntax. You can hand this over to somebody and say, this is the tag you write. Here's the attributes we support. No problem, they're up and running. What's the JavaScript code look like? You have import statements. You have export statements. We're using getters and setters. So, I mean, one of the things that's a little bit different with JavaScript that frameworks kind of give you is we were managing our own data binding. So we had to go write a little bit of code for that. We have lifecycle methods, and we also have a render method. So JavaScript custom elements are following the same patterns, which is why that table I showed you before makes a lot of sense. Like, well, it's easy for everyone to support. We might actually get to this interoperable web. And then there's one other thing to just call out at the bottom. I have to go and register my custom element because I'm doing, just regular JavaScript, and this is how the browser knows about it and uses it. Whereas frameworks themselves, they'll go and declare and take care of a lot of that stuff for you. So there's some differences. 2K of code gzipped for the exact same functionality. Imagine what I could do with 40K of code. That's a lot of components, and that's just the little bit of overhead you get with the framework. Now, observations, though, if you go and look at these things from what do you have to educate yourself about as a developer today? Starting with Vue, I mean, everyone's got to kind of learn a little bit of JavaScript. You've got to learn the Vue template syntax, like it's a very specific thing. You've got to learn these V- attributes, and there's a lot of them. They do use standard DOM events, which is awesome, very redeeming value, so that's something you don't have to go and learn if you're going into Vue. If you're going to make a larger application and want to manage data state, Vuex is right there, and you're going to have to go learn about that. But the more important thing is versions. So Vue just released their 3rd version. And actually, when I didn't know anything about Vue before I went and wrote these samples. When I was trying to learn, I spent a horrible amount of time deciding, am I going to write in Vue version 1 or 2, because there's more documentation for version 1. Version 2, it's like starting to come out. Now version 3 is released. So I went with the pattern at the time. React has made a different set of decisions. We talked a little bit about JSX and how you're mixing in markup with script. Props and state, I actually made a rookie mistake in React. You guys feel free to laugh at me. I went and I bound my input box to a property. Do you know what that means? You can't edit it. It's static. So then I learned about state. Okay, I made a mistake, but you know what? I had to go learn that. That wasn't something that was just intuitive. It was something that was really React had made a decision. React also uses synthetic events. Very good decision for them to go use synthetic events. They can guarantee events work exactly how they want them to work. But I was like, why do I have to camel case my events this way when normally I don't do that in HTML? So these are things that you had to learn. Also, there's Redux and Flux pattern. And React has versions too. And React's had a lot of breaking changes, right? Over the, what is it, React version 16 something, if anyone knows. But these are the things with frameworks. In JavaScript, we were writing JavaScript code. We were calling standard HTML templates, standard HTML events, standard DOM. It's all standard. So to educate yourself on this, it's also applicable to all these frameworks. And I found writing the JavaScript first helped me then do these comparisons to frameworks where I think if I started with a framework, I would have been siloed. So these are some observations. And again, I'm not saying don't go write anything in a framework, but I'm saying look under the hood. Like there's tremendous value in actually JavaScript. So the takeaways for today is really, we see JavaScript is sort of the next framework. It's a standards-based thing, and the skill set to go and develop in JavaScript is just standard web development. You don't have to go and learn any specific thing for a framework. I really encourage you to use the GitHub project that we created. Feel free to send us PRs, fork it, do whatever you want. If you have any questions, it was a lot of fun to build, and it was kind of a lot of fun to just make it work in Visualforce. So you'll find if you follow the README file and the steps, you'll have this app up and running on a Scratch org, and you can play around with localhost development, deploy it, and see it running. So with that, I would like to open for any questions I have in 12 seconds. But what I'm going to do, since they told me there's no mics for questions, I'm going to just come down to the front of the stage. If you want to chat and have some questions, come on up and we can talk more about this. But thank you so much for attending.